Boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Eu agradeço ao professor Franz Kaiser e ao professor André Brasil.
I would like to thank Professor Franz Kaiser and Professor André Brasil for being here with us. I would also like to thank the Brazilian Association of Educational Assessment, or ABAVI, for holding such an important event, Combratre. Now, before we get officially started, let's watch a short video. We'll be starting this panel right after the video.
Acho que está sem som.
I think we have no sound.
Vou perguntar as
We still have no sound, so there's no translation for now.
Bianca, não está chegando o áudio do vídeo, tá?
Bianca, we apologize, but we have no sound here.
Iremos estar passando no final, então?
Podemos sim, vamos. Enquanto vocês
All right,
resolvem...
we can watch this video after the presentations today then. So let me just check, do we have our two speakers here, Bianca?
Os palestrantes estão sim, já estão.
Yes, our speakers are here. Great, thank you. Then we'll be watching this video at the end of the presentations. But first and foremost, I would like to thank ABAVI for holding this event. I would also like to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors are extremely important for us, for all the activities that we carry out and for the events that we offer. They have traditionally been supporting us with our events. Now, in the opening video we'll see later, you'll be able to hear each of their names. So today we'll be talking about something extremely important for higher education. We'll be discussing methodologies to put together rankings. Recently in Brazil, researchers and Professor Franz Kaiser were discussing the new methodology by CAPES, the Brazilian Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel, for multiple rankings or rankings where you take into account a number of factors to assess graduation programs. In this sense, Professor Franz Kaiser and Professor André Brasil, who works for CAPES, are going to discuss this topic. After their presentations, we'll have a panel to discuss how to build these methodologies. Through these methodologies, we're able to put together a ranking system with different points of view. This is something we'll get to learn about during these talks. So thank you to our speakers. Professor Franz Kaiser has a master's in public administration. He works at the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. During his career at the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies, he has been involved in numerous international comparative studies on higher education policies and trends in higher education. He has been the coordinator of a number of projects in which tools and visualizations were developed to allow for the analysis and presentation of large, complex data sets on higher education and higher education institutions. One of the biggest examples of that is the U-Multirank project, which is our major topic today. Franz has visited Brazil. He came to Brazil in 2018 and has since been working with the Metricas project. Now, Professor André Brasil works at CAPES. He has been working for CAPES since 2009. Currently, he is also developing research at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, the CWTS, at the Leiden University in the Netherlands. His biggest work is related to the assessment system connected to the Brazilian system of graduation programs, looking for studies in higher education and public policies. So let me hand it over to Professor Franz Kaiser. Professor Kaiser, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Professor Neto, for these kind words. And you can all, can you hear me? Yes, okay, thank you very much. Let me share my presentation with you on U-Multirank. And yes. U-Multirank, let's split like this. I'm not going to talk about U-Multirank in very much detail, but more on the broader approach that U-Multirank uses in comparing the performances of higher education institutions in an international setting. Why did we start with U-Multirank? Well, we did have, when we started in 2009, we did have some global rankings, but the information that these rankings actually provided wasn't very satisfactory for the purpose we had in mind, which is to understand and compare the performance of higher education institutions in a fair way. And that has to do with the diversity of higher education institutions' missions. Not all universities or higher education institutions are the same. They have differences in the missions, whether it is research, whether it is knowledge transfer, or teaching and learning. I mean, they have a different balance in these core activities, and that makes it difficult to compare everyone with everyone. So we wanted to make a tool that could compare like with like. One of the reasons why we needed this is that we needed this information to support decision-making, this evidence-based decision-making, both at the national level, so for national policymakers, as at the international level, at the European level, but also at the level of the institutions, and mainly in their strategic and quality management. Another use for U-Multirank and a purpose for developing it was that we needed to facilitate benchmarking between higher education institutions. And for that, one of the first steps is compare like with like, and that's what we had U-Multirank for. Okay. Now we know the purpose of U-Multirank. How did we go about? What was the basic approach? And I listed here 5 basic principles that actually made it different from the existing global rankings. The first basic principle is that it's multidimensional. And I'll go back to these principles later on. So it has the performance of an institution is not only one dimension, for instance, teaching and learning, or only research, but it has different functions. It has different activities. And if the ranking is multidimensional, all these different activities, different performances are made more transparent. Whereas these existing rankings actually had only one score, which put together all these different activities, all these functions, and you were not able to disentangle these different performances. So that's why we made it multidimensional. We also made it multi-level, which means that we are not only at the institutional level a ranking, which was the common practice, but we also have it at the subject level, which made it more attractive to one major audience, and these were the students. They were looking for information not that much on the institutional level, but at the level of the program they wanted to study. And that's why we had the program level or the subject level included there. The user-drivenness is a third basic principle of U-Multirank, and that is something that is still quite important, because the user-drivenness includes the user itself in the development and in the use of the tool. And we'll come back to that later, but it is something that is quite important in both in the development, but also in the use of U-Multirank. As I said earlier, I mean, U-Multirank is not a league table. It does not give you one score, one list of institutions, one list of universities where the top one is the best and at the bottom you find the worst. But it's actually more complex than that. And the reason for that is that we don't have any rationale, we don't have any guideline for to weigh all the different performances of an institution. It is not for us to tell, U-Multirank project team, to tell whether a certain dimension, for instance, research or knowledge transfer, is more important or equally important than teaching and learning for a certain institution. So that is why we don't collapse all these information into one score, but we keep it next to each other. That has an advantage, as I said, in making this multidimensionality more transparent. But it has also a negative consequence, and that's you don't have one table which communicates quite difficult. And that's something that we have encountered in our practices over the last years, that if you don't have one table, it's for the media, it's quite difficult to understand what the value is of that information. And the final basic principle that refers to the way that the scores are actually presented. The league tables are very often just have one score, which is with 2 digits, and it is very much, if you are only very small differences in that score, can determine your position on these rank lists. So that means that if you have only a very small difference in performance, in aggregated performance, there can be a huge difference in the position and rank list. So that's why we use categorized scores to get away from that. Okay, let me come back to the multidimensionality. When we developed U-Multirank, we consulted with all kinds of stakeholders, both policymakers at the national level, but also with institutions, not only traditional research universities, but also other types of higher education institutions, to find out what they need for describing their institution and their performance. And the first 3 dimensions there were quite obvious. I mean, it was teaching and learning, and it was research. And that third mission, the knowledge transfer, is something that is becoming more and more part of the traditional functions of higher education institutions. So these 3 dimensions were, well, not disputed. In addition, the stakeholders that we consulted said that it was also very important for an institution to show how internationally oriented it is. So in this international comparison, they wanted to show also what their international orientation was. But a lot of institutions, maybe not the research universities, but the Universities of Applied Sciences, as we call them in the Netherlands, stress very much that they also have a regional function, and that this regional function in their regional engagement is something that is very important in describing their performance as well. So that is why we also included a dimension, the regional engagement, which has links to, for instance, civic engagement and societal engagement. So these are the 5 dimensions that U-Multirank uses to present the performance on. As I said, we have a multi-level approach. The first level is the institution, and the main audience for the analysis at the institutional level are, of course, the universities or the higher education institutions, but also national policymakers are mainly interested in this institutional level. To get the data, U-Multirank uses a number of data sources at the institutional level. First of all, that is a questionnaire at the institution level that we ask, or that we administer. But we also use national databases and international databases with higher education data, both to fill the database, but also our database, but also to verify the information that is provided by the institutions through the questionnaire. In addition to that, we also use information from the Web of Science and from PetStat for providing information on research and on knowledge transfer. And that is partly because that is the main basis for the existing rankings, the scientometric indicators that they provide, we also have now in our database. At the subject level, the main audience are the students. And the students are using this information if they want to find programs that are worthwhile considering for going to abroad. Another audience here are the departments that are providing the programs, because they can use this information for benchmarking purposes. Here the data sources are slightly different. We use a questionnaire at the department level, but the main source of information is a student survey where we ask students mainly about their satisfaction with the program they are having. And here as well, we use information on the Web of Science for research-related indicators. Now, the user-drivenness, as I said, is quite an important element in the approach of Multirank. First of all, in the design of U-Multirank, when we designed it in early 2010, we used the stakeholders as a major sounding board for the selection of the indicators on these 5 dimensions. So we had a list of indicators and we asked the stakeholders whether they thought the indicators were relevant, but also whether they actually could have information on it. But in the selection of indicators, that was a quite important role of stakeholders, but it is also in the design of the user interfaces and the other tools that we have at U-Multirank. And I'll come back to these user interfaces in a moment. That was the design of U-Multirank, where users are quite important, but users are also important in how you use U-Multirank. It sounds a little bit strange, but the tool allows the users to create its own ranking. So the user-drivenness here relates or actually produces a very large amount of individualized rankings, but we'll come back to that later. If you look at the selection of indicators, you can also see that the different type of user has also an impact there. This is the list of indicators that is available for students at the subject ranking. And you can see in the green, teaching and learning has a lot of indicators and compared to the other dimensions. And if you look at the indicators at the institutional level, you can see that the green part of the whole set of indicators is much smaller. So at the institutional level, we have only a few indicators on teaching and learning, but many more on research, knowledge transfer, and the other dimensions. This visualization is also one of the things that we use for communicating at a easy way the multidimensional results of the ranking, or actually I shouldn't say ranking, it's actually a transparency tool. It presents the scores on the various indicators next to each other. So I don't know whether I can show that. So these are individual indicators as they are listed here. And you can see here all the different levels that they can have. And if we produced one profile of one institution, you can see later on that this will, well, actually I can go there now. You can see that there are different levels of scores, and the missing scores are here as well. So you get from this university, you get immediately at a glance an idea that they are doing relatively well in teaching and learning, but the scores in knowledge transfer are not very high compared to all the institutions in U-Multirank, but they are doing quite well in those indicators that they have information on in terms of regional engagement. So this is a way of presenting all kinds of different information at one visualization, so you can get an idea of the profile of this institution. Now, if we move back, this is the way these categories are actually determined. Maybe this is a little bit too technical here, but we use a median score of all the institutions that are there in U-Multirank, and we have a bandwidth of 25%. So if you are above the median score on, for instance, this is the percentage of graduates graduating on time. If you're above that upper limit, then you have an A score, the top score. And if you are below that, you have a B, a C, a D, or if you have a 0 score there, then actually you have an E score. So this is the way we categorize these data. That's very. And here are these 5 levels in the visualization. A different way of presenting that information is in a, what you might say, it's not a league table, it's not one league table, but it's a table where you can actually have a list of institutions ordered by whatever indicator you think is relevant for you. So, and if you, this is the default list. So if you make a selection in the web tool of the institutions that you want to compare, then you get this list of indicators: bachelor graduation rate, graduation on time, and so on. And for all the 5 dimensions, there are indicators there. But you can actually select what indicators you want. And if you make a different selection, for instance, if you want to have more attention to teaching and learning, then you get also a different list of institutions here, because you can order them by top score, which means that the number of A scores, and you get a different list there. And I can show you that here. If you have, for instance, oh, this one has more research indicators in it, and you get a different list of institutions that are on top of this list. But you can do that in all different ways. So you can actually have your own personalized ranking. Okay, I just briefly now want to show you one of the new developments. That's the benchmarking tool within U-Multirank. As I said, benchmarking is something for the institutions, it's quite important. And we are testing at the moment a tool, an interactive tool on benchmarking, where you actually can select one institution, for instance, let's see, Sao Paulo, a number of other institutions that you want to compare with, and also network of institutions. But the interesting thing here is that it's not only those that you know, but you also can, based on a number of the characteristics of these institutions, for instance, the age or the size, and the performance of the institution on all the indicators that are available, you can make a selection of institutions that fit that profile. So here we actually look at the graduate students, so institutions that have a similar proportion of graduate students, and we look at those who have a similar graduation rate or actually have a slightly better graduation rate. And there you get an overview of the institutions, where this one is the one that you selected. That's your own is Sao Paulo. These are the other Brazilians, and these are the ones that are actually selected through the system. So you can use the system to make a comparison, which is very much linked to your preferences. And you can do it in this way, where you just have a list of the scores on one indicator, where you can actually change the indicator, but you also can relate the indicator scores on one indicator to another indicator. So you get a better overview of, a better feeling of the performance of this institution, your own institution, with the other institutions that you've selected. So that is the benchmark tool. And that's actually where I wanted to end this presentation. Just a brief overview of the basic principles. So it's multidimensional, it's multi-level, it's user-driven, it doesn't produce league tables, and it does use categorized scores. And the main thing is that this is not a traditional ranking, which is very much vertical. It has a top one. It is very much focused on assessment, on competition, whereas U-Multirank is much more focused on providing the opportunity to institutions and other policymakers to enter a learning journey, to learn from the performance of others. And that's actually the main reason why U-Multirank is there, to provide that information to its users. That's about the presentation on the approach. I think that we have later on ample time for discussion on this. If there are questions, and I don't know whether the question is time for questions now, but otherwise we will do that after the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Professor Franz Kaiser.
Thank you very much, Professor Franz Kaiser. Let me now hand it over to Professor André Brazil, and then we can have a Q&A in the end. But thank you again for your presentation. Let's now hear Professor André Brazil. Thank you, Professor Neto. I hope everyone can hear me well. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. My participation in the U-Multirank approach started a long time ago. I'm really happy to be a part of this new chapter. Now, as a speaker today, I decided not to have a formal presentation, but I was making some notes, taking some notes during Franz's presentation, because I want to give you a little bit of context about Brazil. Number one, I'm a big fan of the U-Multirank. Many ranking experts right now mention two rankings that are closer to fulfilling the needs of the scientific community and the educational community in a higher education context. Multirank, U-Multirank, and Leidenrank. Now, let me tell you why these are among the best, or they are the best according to many experts. In the case of the Leiden ranking, this ranking does not try to be a ranking system. This is a bibliometric analysis system using a number of sophisticated indicators out there to allow for users to explore these indicators however they want to, so that they can really see how institutions are performing. Now, since the Leiden ranking uses sophisticated indicators, and since they don't want to say what is best and what is worst, it actually provides our communities with important information so that people can make their own decision and make their own conclusions. Now, with the U-Multirank, it uses the same sophisticated indicators. By the way, they are provided by the Center of Information here in Leiden. So they are using with the best indicators out there for research. But on top of that, they also do their research, they work on studies, they collect data based on national databases, and that is how they build a system that goes beyond the analysis of data. But the main thing about the U-Multirank is that it doesn't want to calculate a score for people. And this is a big piece of criticism a lot of people have, not only regarding rankings, but also regarding indicators that are used to assess research, to assess researchers, or in Brazil for graduation programs. Because oftentimes people have indicators that try to become or mean a specific score or a specific number of points. And the U-Multirank does not want to do that. It doesn't give you a final score. It actually shows you the profile of a given institution, and this information could be used by users. Now, let me talk about Brazil. We started discussing the use of a model that was at least inspired by U-Multirank in 2017 for graduation programs. We have periodic assessments, and I was there for these assessments in 2010, 2013, and 2017. And let me tell you something, I'm really proud of our community in Brazil, especially when we compare it to the international community. And when we think about these strides that we've made in our assessment systems, the quality of our data, and the attention that is now being paid to a more qualitative assessment. Because the quantitative assessment is already good enough, and we have dashboards and indicators and panels, and all of this information is available to us, but we've made a lot of progress with the qualitative assessment. And then we got to a certain point, which Franz touched upon, the mission of our graduation programs. And in my experience, when I was in the assessment board, working with the network programs, Prof. Mathematics, Prof. Physics, Prof. Languages, etc. In this case, we had a board with experts from many different fields, and we were trying to work on assessments from a completely different take. Think about Prof. Mathematics. In this case, we want to put together a group of teachers who are highly skilled to teach in Brazil. So in this case, we have a lot of people in this system, but we want to have a lot of impact in a social mission. Now, how can we compare that to PPG mathematics score, which should be 7, for the Math Institute in São Carlos? You can't compare these. These are different systems, different goals, different missions. And in our comparisons, we would compare math programs to math programs, physics programs to physics programs. At CAPES, we have an interdisciplinary department with over 300 graduation programs, and we try to create a benchmark. Professor Franz was talking about this, but how can we do this properly with so many differences and so many specificities? When we try and optimize indicators, we end up having an impact on this system, and we influence this system to adopt a model that is considered the excellence model. However, there's so much diversity. We don't have the same mission everywhere. In some regions, we have institutions with a lot of courses, and in other regions of Brazil, we have institutions with a few courses that are very good. So we need to assess these programs in different ways, and we need to take their missions into account. Otherwise, we're going to influence programs to become something that they should not be. So this is something that we started discussing back then. We knew that we had to make progress in this. We knew that not only did we have to compare these programs and assess their quality, but we should also take into account what these programs want to be and what Brazil expects from them. And this worked out really well. CAPES in 2018 went through an extensive discussion on how to make these assessments in Brazil. We had working groups to talk about specific topics, for example. I was in a group reviewing assessment forms. We also worked on another group with technical assessments for graduation programs. We had a number of working groups, impact in Brazil or on Brazil, self-assessment, etc., etc. We have experts and representatives from different agencies working together in these working groups. We had very fruitful conversations. We even held international seminars and congresses. I am here in the Netherlands, the origin of the Leiden Manifest, and we were able to discuss these concepts in these congresses. So in Brazil, we were having conversations on how to improve our assessment in a very responsible way. Now, simultaneously, we had a committee for the national graduation programs. And they were doing their work and they were analyzing everything that we were doing and working with it to offer additional subsidies for this assessment. That's when they started talking about the multidimensional models, and we started talking about U-Multirank. We started mentioning it as a potential solution, and then we had a committee with people from CAPES, from PMPG. Some people traveled to Europe, they came to the Netherlands, they went to Germany, and they were discussing the possibility of using this. You know, things were working out really well. And of course, when we elect new politicians, when we have new administrations, things change a bit and we have to adapt to it. But we kept on making progress. So last year, we saw the final proposal for the PMPG group, inspired by the U-Multirank mostly. But in my opinion, and of course I work for CAPES, however, in this case, I'm going to share my opinion with you, and I do not represent CAPES here. So in my opinion, the proposal that we have right now uses the 5 pillars brought about by U-Multirank and does the math for graduation programs according to these 5 pillars. So instead of getting 1 score, these programs are going to get 5 scores. And yes, this is progress. This is a step forward. It is, because at the end of the day, we are providing value to things that sometimes we would ignore in previous scores. For example, social impact, which would account for only 10% of our score. So either very good or very bad performances would get lost in these scores. So at least here we have more options and we can attribute more value to these things, these 5 pillars. So this is progress, but we still have a system where we get scores. And this leads to distortions. In the case of the U-Multirank, this doesn't happen. Because with the U-Multirank, there's no score. You see different profiles and you see information about the indicators that we have there in that chart. So you can look at this information and figure out whatever is more relevant to you as an individual user. And you may be a student, a researcher, or a public policy manager. This has to do with the Dutch model that Franz mentioned. In the Netherlands, we have 41 universities for applied science and 14 universities for research. Now, the high school program giving access to these universities are different. For applied sciences, you go to high school for 5 years. For research, you have 6 years of high school, and you have different profiles and different syllabuses. And that's perfect, because for one approach, you're geared towards research, and the other approach is more geared towards applied uses. In Brazil, out of 2,500 institutes of higher education, according to our last survey, under 500 of them have graduation programs, and that's all right. That's not a problem. But the problem is trying to compare apples to oranges. With the U-Multirank system that Franz was showing, there's a scale, there's a table where you can choose the indicators you're interested in. And then you try and list these institutions according to these indicators. With the U-Multirank system right now, if we add all 28 or 29 Brazilian institutions in this multi-rank, if we list them according to every bit of metric that is available, we'll see that the ESPM school is going to rank first. The Catholic University in Rio Grande do Sul is going to rank second, and I think the São Paulo State University is going to rank third. So you see, these are different rankings. Now, this is still the case because we don't have a lot of Brazilian institutions into this system. Let me give you an example. Franz showed a chart with the Federal University of Ceará, and we had 4 metrics there. One of them was very good, the other one, or 2 of them were good, and 1 of them was average. For the Rio de Janeiro Federal University, these 4 indicators are blank. They haven't been filled out. But this is an institution with thousands and thousands of students. They are really good for their undergraduation courses. But within the U-Multirank system, there's no information about them. So my biggest point here is that being multidimensional could be really, really good if we think about getting inspired for assessments in Brazil. This applies both to higher education overall and graduation programs. We need to be able to assess different things differently. We need to work with our mission, we need to work with our goals, and we need to look for indicators as much as possible to allow for us to tell this story. This is something we have been trying to do in graduation courses. We should also be working on self-assessments, because individuals are the people who are most qualified to talk about their story. They can judge whether or not they are doing well based on that, and they can back it up with evidence connected to what they do. So if we think about an occupational master's, for example, do we need as evidence a lot of articles that have been published in international journals, or would patents and practical projects be more connected to the reality of these programs? We need to put that on the scale.
Como inspiração, acho perfeito, funciona muito bem. Eu acho que a gente tem muitas lições a aprender com isso. Por outro lado,
are aspects that work really well, and we have to learn from them. And we have multi-ranking for Brazilians as well. This is a fantastic ranking that has to be adopted for Brazilian institutions, but it needs to be adopted. So institutions need to be active and participate. They need to share data. They need to work jointly with a multi-rank team so that we can develop surveys, so that we can really populate the database where that information and data is going to be, so that we can have these rankings. So I just wanted to come to the end of my presentation with actually a question to Franz. A few days ago, he mentioned that in the case of U-Multirank, there is a plan to create a version that is adapted to the Brazilian context, because there are a number of indicators that work for the rest of the world, but that do not work for Brazil. That has been done for Spain, if I'm not mistaken. So they already have a system that is more suitable, better adjusted to the instruction system in Spain. And apparently there is an interest of doing the same to Brazil. So Franz, if you could please comment on that. Thank you. Thank you, Professor André Brazil, for your comments and explanations. We have questions from the audience, but before we go over these questions, I'd like to give you the floor, Professor Kaiser, so that you can answer Professor Brazil's question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Andre, for the very inspiring talk. And the question that is very relevant, and actually, at the moment we are working with this is SEMESP, so that's, I think it's a private universities in Brazil, but we are also including public universities to find out whether we can use existing data systems in Brazil to pre-populate the questionnaires database for Brazilian universities. So that is one way to boost participation of Brazilian universities. On the other hand, I fully embrace your call for Brazilian universities to become more active and in providing information to U-Multirank, in filling out the questionnaire, because that's another way to get a full profile. Now, this full profile, and you're absolutely correct, is something that is a global thing. I mean, we have one profile in terms of the indicators that are there for all institutions. And what we learned also from our visits to Brazil in 2018 is that there are quite some regional, and I mean global regions, regional differences in the relevance of these indicators. And especially in Brazil, there is a type of indicators that is underrepresented or even missing, which is this social engagement. The social task of the university in Brazil is something that is not very well represented in U-Multirank. And for that purpose, we have, it's a nice coincidence, more or less. We had two interns who actually came from Brazil and who have looked into the situation in Brazil and compared the Brazilian system for external, for ProX, so these extension activities with a European system. Actually, it's also a project, a research project, which calls DevKey, on community engagement. And they found some interesting overlap between the Brazilian approach and the European approach. But the problem is that the European approach is not yet integrated in U-Multirank. So we are working now on thinking of how could we actually integrate that kind of activities, that approach as well, to make the relevance for Brazilian universities of U-Multirank much bigger. And, making some kind of a optional dimension. For instance, adding a dimension that is for one region more relevant to another. So you could actually have a profile with and without that dimension, which would make it for Brazilian universities much more relevant. That is something that we are working on, thinking of this at this moment. At the same time, we are also within this more global approach, we are also thinking of new indicators in terms of sustainable development, social inclusion, and new teaching methods. Challenge-based learning. How could you incorporate the performance in that into U-Multirank? So we are thinking of new indicators, new approaches, new dimensions to keep U-Multirank up to date and also more relevant for all institutions globally. So that whether you are in one region or another, that you still can attune U-Multirank to the regional needs. And I also welcome very much your initiative to apply the approach that U-Multirank uses to the assessment of the programs in Brazil. And but I have also to underline that U-Multirank is very much something about a learning journey, something about learning from each other, and far less than assessment or how to put it, accountability, that you have to show what you did, but it's more like, what can you learn from it? And your link with self-assessment is very important in that, because that's also focused on this learning journey. But I stop now. I want to give some more space to questions from the audience.
Muito obrigado, Professor Franz.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have two categories here for suggestions, for questions. So I am going to be directing questions to Professor Franz Kaiser or to Professor André Brazil. So, Franz, you know Brazil, and you've come here, right? You were here in 2018 with CAPES, and you've been working with the private system using CEMESP. So as you know, we have a very complex higher education system with federal public universities, state public universities, city or municipal public universities. We have some institutions that have very specific characteristics. They have their own specificities, focusing on regional development. However, and this is where the structure and the tradition and higher education come into play, the system is regulated by the state. The public universities are regulated by the federal government. So trying to summarize it, the question would be the following. How do you see the U-Multirank methodology being applied to regulate it from a state regulation perspective? If you see that as a possibility, or would that be far too complex? And that is for undergraduate courses, and then we can talk about graduate courses too.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting question. Normally, I would say, U-Multirank is very much fit for this. We have in Europe, we have also a vast diversity of higher education institutions, or even in a small country like the Netherlands. We have institutions that have only 500 students and only teacher training. And we have comprehensive universities of more than 30,000 students. So there's a large diversity also within the very small system as the Netherlands. And the trick is, of course, that if you want to use U-Multirank in comparing the performance, then the first step is quite important, that you select those institutions that can be compared in a meaningful way. And what is meaningful is, on the one hand, well, I think that's mainly in the eye of the user, that what is meaningful or not. So it's not meaningful, for instance, for a small teacher training college to be compared to a large university. That's not a very meaningful comparison. But they might learn from another institution in Spain, which has the same characteristics. The issue is, and that is something that is quite important, the issue is, if you put it in the context of learning from each other, then it's a very valuable experience. And of course, you have different contexts and you can take that into account, but you can also see how they organize their processes and how they did, and improve your own performance. If you put it in the context of assessment, then it becomes a difficult thing, because then it's not that much about this learning and what can we, how can we adapt to that, but it's on a set of rules of norms that are set beforehand. And then it becomes tricky to, you have to do that in a very smart way, also mission related. So if you do an assessment, you have to be able to not only just have some kind of absolute norms, but also have something that is mission related. So if you have a small teaching college, that shouldn't be compared on the same standards as a large research university, even if they both have the same type of programs, because the conditions are quite different. So that is something that is the trick to how to solve this. That's the challenge. How to find those matching programs that you can actually assess on the same criteria and with the same weights. That's, I think, a challenge, but it is a necessary challenge because otherwise you run into the problem that or the risk of abusing U-Multirank and still end up in the same monodimensional comparison that you want to get away from.
Bom, acho que você pegou muito bem, Franz. Eu acho que, primeiro,
Yes, Professor Franz. I believe you said something really important. From an overall perspective, this methodology is really applicable to our reality because of the complexity of our country, because of the size of Brazil, and because of the different missions that different higher education institutes have. And right now in Brazil, we have been having conversations about this. Nationally speaking, we have heavy regulations for this system. But we've come to realize that these institutes should have different missions, not only depending on their region, but also depending on their goals. They can choose a path for themselves as a higher education institute, because we have so many possibilities in Brazil. And the 5 dimensions in the U-Multirank are really useful for that. But, as you were saying, we need to balance the possibility of having this kind of assessment and having this way forward, and also the role played by Brazil, because this is in our constitution. In one of our provisions in our constitution, we see that private institutions can also venture into education in Brazil, but assessments and regulations are for the state to regulate. The state is responsible for governing that. So it is important to strike balance here, and I believe this methodology is in alignment with what we've been envisioning for the future. Now, let me focus on André for a bit to talk about graduate courses. André was mentioning multidimensional assessments for graduate courses, and this has already been developed. But let me ask you a question, André. In graduate programs, would you like to do that to ensure we have diversity in graduation or graduate programs? And this is a bit complex because this is also about resources and incentives and how money is transferred to these institutions. So, André, what do you think about using these multi-dimension methodologies for assessment in graduate programs? I think this is tricky. In Brazil, we have what we call high-stakes assessments. One of the highest stakes assessments that I've ever seen, because the scores of your assessments allow for you to stay within the system, otherwise you're no longer authorized to operate. Oftentimes, these scores are connected to the grants you receive, to the endowments you receive, and to support not only from CAPES, but from other state agencies as well. This puts a lot of pressure on institutions. However, when we start using an alternative multidimensional model, we allow for diversity and difference. And this is excellent because we start appreciating different opportunities and different propositions. Let me give you an example. One of the most traditional metrics, most heavily used in graduate programs, is the assessment of teachers according to a distribution of functions. Teachers have to teach and then do research, and then write. However, we do know that some teachers will be better in the classroom and other teachers will be better in research. Some of them are great mentors or advisors, and some of them are not. So why should we not allow for flexibility so that these teachers can play to their strengths? The same thing applies to a graduate program. We want these programs to make the most out of their strengths. So with a multi-dimension scheme, we're able to take the temperature of a certain program in a more useful way. In this case, we can use more complex metrics that are going to truly represent a given program. But then, what should we do based on that? That's the tricky part, because 1 plus 1 won't always equal 2. That is why we'll need a flexible program. Think about sponsorships or funding. If a program has a multidimensional approach with different scores and different assessments, you could have different lines of funding. For example, specific funding for grants for research, other lines of funding for great scores in knowledge transfer. So if a system is more complex, everything gets more complex. And one of the biggest hurdles that we have is this. When we use metrics in a system where there's a lot of connection between funding and stability and the scores of these assessments, when we depart from traditional systems, we depart from these metrics as well. Because when you have a ranking and you're ranking 11th, for example, if they had funding for the 10 people ranking first, you're not going to get funding, and it's easier to explain that. But with a qualitative model, how can you explain not giving funding to someone? It gets more complex. In other countries where people have less high-stakes assessments, and when things are not so tightly connected, it's a bit easier. But in Brazil, this is going to be challenging, especially when it comes to funding allocation. But I think it is worth it. We should tackle this challenge. Yes, I think we should be thinking about bringing diversity to this system. Because with graduate programs in Brazil, we've had a short run so far. Of course, there has been a lot of progress in the past 2 decades, but we need more diversity in this system. And I think we need to revisit the role of the state. And of course, the state is going to have a role because this is set forth in our Constitution. Great. These were great considerations. Again, thank you, Professors Franz Kaiser, and thank you, Professor Andre Brazil, for everything you've shared with us. I would also like to thank our audience. And now I think we can watch the video that we were supposed to watch at the beginning of this presentation, because we'll see a message from the president of our association and our coordinator.
Olá, boa tarde. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês.
Hi, good afternoon. We're so happy to be with you again. I am here to say I do hope you enjoy this online event. Tomorrow, we'll have the official opening ceremony at 10:30 in the morning for our 11th meeting. We do hope next time we're together face to face. Enjoy this event, and I will now hand it over to Reinaldo. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Maria Elena. We were supposed to have Combra Tree last year in person. Because of the pandemic, we had to postpone this event, and then we ended up canceling it. We are now holding this event this year with ABAVI, the Brazilian Association for Educational Assessment. Next year, we do hope Combra Tree happens again in person. But welcome to our event. We do hope you enjoy Combra Tree today, and as of tomorrow, ABAVI's meeting. Thank you.
Bom, então, mais uma vez, agradecendo aos convidados.
All right. Once again, I would like to thank our speakers and our audience and wish you a great day. Take care. Thank you.
Obrigado, até a próxima.
Thank you very much. Take care.